The morning my wife Sandra served me divorce papers with a smile on her face telling me she was taking half of everything was the same morning I realized that 20 years of planning was about to pay off in the most satisfying way imaginable. And she had no idea that the broke man she thought she was leaving was actually worth 10 times what she was stealing from me. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. My name is Richard Thompson, but everyone calls me Dick. And at 68 years old, I can honestly say that the best decision I ever made in my life was not trusting my second wife with the truth about my finances from the very first day. I met her at that charity gala in Miami, where she was hunting for her next victim, dressed in a red Versace dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. You see, I had already been through one divorce in my 40s with my first wife, Linda, who was the mother of my 2 children, Michael and Rebecca. And that split had been amicable and fair because Linda was a good woman who simply grew apart from me, as happens sometimes in life. And we divided everything equally with no hard feelings and remained friends to this day actually. But when I met Sandra at 58 years old, fresh off selling my construction company for what everyone thought was $2 million, I could smell the gold digger on her from across the room like expensive perfume mixed with desperation and greed. And I watched with fascination as she worked the room like a professional, calculating the net worth of every man there. Sandra was 38 when we met, making her 20 years younger than me with the kind of beauty that was clearly her primary career. And she had that practiced laugh and way of touching your arm that told you she had done this dance many times before with other wealthy older men who fell for her act. She was between husbands at the time, having just finished divorcing husband number 2, a real estate developer named Frank Morrison, who she had taken for everything he had according to the gossip at the country club, leaving him living in a 1-bedroom apartment while she kept the mansion. And she was actively shopping for husband number 3 with the determination of a professional athlete training for the Olympics. Within 10 minutes of meeting me, she had already found out through seemingly casual conversation that I was recently divorced, financially successful, and lonely, which was like blood in the water for a shark like her. And I watched with amusement as she moved in for what she thought would be an easy kill, using every trick in her considerable playbook. She complimented my watch, a Rolex Submariner, asking if it was real, then laughing as if the question was ridiculous while mentally adding up its value. And she mentioned how she had always been attracted to older men because they were more sophisticated and established, unlike younger guys who were so immature and broke. Now you might wonder why I pursued a relationship with someone I knew was only interested in my money. And the answer is complex. But essentially, I was lonely, bored, and frankly, she was beautiful and charming when she wanted to be. And I figured I could enjoy the companionship while protecting myself financially, which would require careful planning and execution. What Sandra didn't know was that the sale of my construction company, Thompson Construction, which I had built from nothing over 30 years, was actually structured in a very particular way, with only $500,000 going into accounts that would be visible during any divorce proceedings, while the real money, $4.3 million, was placed in offshore trusts and foreign corporations that my attorney Marcus Goldman had set up years earlier when I first started making serious money. Marcus was a genius at asset protection, having learned from helping other wealthy men lose everything in divorces that the key was to never let the assets be findable in the first place, not to hide them after marriage, but to structure them before, so they technically didn't exist on paper, at least not in any way that connected to me personally. The trusts were set up in the Cook Islands and Nevis, with corporate structures in Delaware and Wyoming that owned other corporations that owned other assets in a chain so complex that even forensic accountants would need years to untangle it if they even knew where to start looking, which they wouldn't because there was no paper trail leading to them. The brilliant part was that these structures were completely legal and had been established years before I even met Sandra originally to protect assets from potential lawsuits in the construction business. But they worked perfectly for protecting wealth from gold-digging spouses, as well, which Marcus had mentioned might be a useful side benefit. I also made sure to live a lifestyle that matched the $500,000 I officially had rather than the $4.8 million. I actually controlled driving a nice, but not extravagant Mercedes E-Class, instead of the Ferrari. I could afford living in a beautiful but not mansion-level house in Coral Gables worth about $800,000. Instead of the $5 million estate I could have bought and maintaining the image of a comfortably wealthy retiree, but not a multimillionaire, which required constant discipline and attention to detail. Sandra took the bait, completely convinced she had found a decent mark worth maybe $1 million or $2 million in total assets, which was still worth her time and effort. And she turned on the full charm offensive with a determination that was actually impressive in its calculating efficiency, studying my interests and preferences like she was preparing for an exam. She suddenly developed a passion for golf because I played twice a week, and she hired a private instructor to get good enough to join me on the course, where she would wear outfit after outfit that showed off her carefully maintained figure while pretending to need help with her swing. She laughed at all my jokes, even the terrible ones, touched my arm, constantly wore increasingly revealing outfits that she claimed were just comfortable for the Florida heat, and somehow always needed my advice or help with something that required us to spend time together, from car trouble to investment advice to choosing a new laptop. Her campaign was methodical and well-planned, and within 6 months she had orchestrated our relationship to the point where marriage seemed inevitable, with all our friends at the country club commenting on what a perfect couple we made and how lucky I was to have found love again after my divorce from Linda. The proposal came about 8 months after we met, and I made it look like her manipulation had worked perfectly, taking her to Turks and Caicos, to a resort that cost $2,000 a night, where I got down on one knee on the beach at sunset, with a 3-carat diamond ring from Tiffany that cost $40,000, which she immediately posted on Instagram and Facebook to mark her territory and claim her prize to all the other gold diggers in her social circle, who commented with barely concealed jealousy. The wedding 6 months later was elaborate but not obscene, costing about $75,000, which Sandra planned down to the last detail, making sure to invite all her friends who needed to see that she had successfully landed another wealthy husband who would fund her lifestyle. And she made sure the photographer got plenty of shots of the designer dress, the massive cake, and the luxury cars in the background. My children Michael and Rebecca both tried to warn me about Sandra, with Rebecca actually pulling me aside at the wedding reception to ask if I was sure about this, and if I had protected myself financially, which I assured her I had, though I didn't give her the details because the fewer people who knew the truth, the better. Michael was more blunt, telling me that Sandra was obviously a gold digger and that I was making a huge mistake, and he actually refused to give a toast at the wedding, which caused some awkwardness. But I just smiled and told him I knew what I was doing, which was absolutely true, though not in the way he thought. My best friend from college, James Patterson, who had known me for 45 years, was equally skeptical, pulling me aside during the bachelor party to ask if I had lost my mind marrying someone so obviously after my money. But I assured him I had everything under control, which he didn't believe, but respected enough not to push further. The first few years of marriage were actually pleasant enough, with Sandra playing the role of devoted wife to perfection, as long as the credit cards kept working, and the lifestyle kept flowing. And she had no reason to suspect that she wasn't seeing the full financial picture, because I was careful to make everything look completely normal and transparent. She decorated our house hiring an interior designer named Philippe, who charged $50,000 to essentially paint everything white and add some modern art that looked like my 5-year-old grandson could have made. And she joined the most expensive gym in Miami, where she worked out with her personal trainer Diego 3 times a week. Diego was 28 years old with the kind of body that belonged on the cover of fitness magazines, and Sandra claimed she needed such intensive training to stay in shape for me, which was sweet. But we both knew she was staying in shape to maintain her market value for when she eventually traded up to a richer husband. I funded all of this gladly from the visible accounts, knowing that every dollar she spent was being carefully documented by Marcus, who was building a comprehensive file of her spending patterns and lifestyle expectations that would be crucial when the inevitable divorce came, because I knew from her history that Sandra never stayed married longer than 5 to 7 years. Sandra's greed was actually fascinating to observe up close, like watching a nature documentary about predators, as she constantly pushed for more expensive purchases, larger houses, better cars, and exotic vacations, always with elaborate justifications about how we deserved it, or how it would make us happy, or how life was too short not to enjoy our wealth. She would pout and give me the silent treatment if I suggested something was too expensive, and she became an expert at emotional manipulation, using sex affection and carefully timed fights to get what she wanted from me, including a $100,000 renovation of our already perfect kitchen, because the appliances were 2 years old and apparently outdated. She also developed expensive hobbies like collecting designer handbags that cost $5,000 to $10,000 each, and she had an entire room dedicated to storing them in climate-controlled conditions like they were rare wines. And she would spend hours researching the next bag she wanted to add to her collection, showing me pictures and explaining why this particular Hermes or Chanel was a good investment. The most ridiculous purchase was a $15,000 purse that was supposedly made from alligator skin and could only hold a lipstick and credit card, but Sandra insisted it was a collector's item that would appreciate in value even though she never carried it anywhere because she was afraid of damaging it. Her circle of friends consisted entirely of other trophy wives and gold diggers who would meet for lunch at expensive restaurants, where they would compare their latest purchases and complain about their husbands while planning their next conquests. And I sometimes wondered if they had a secret handbook they all followed because their strategies were remarkably similar. There was Jennifer, who had married and divorced 3 oil executives, each divorce netting her more money than the last, and was currently working on number 4, a 90-year-old billionaire with heart problems, who she expected to outlive within the year based on his medical history, which she had somehow obtained. There was Patricia, who specialized in professional athletes and had 2 kids from 2 different NBA players, collecting child support that totaled more than most people's annual salaries. And she was currently pregnant with a 3rd child from an NFL quarterback who didn't know the baby might not be his. And there was Monica, the most successful of them all, who had somehow convinced her elderly husband to adopt her as his daughter before he died, ensuring she inherited everything as his only legal child, which was either genius or sociopathic depending on how you looked at it. And Sandra studied her like she was a master class in gold digging. The turning point came about 3 years into our marriage, when Sandra started getting sloppy and careless, probably because she felt secure in her position and didn't think she needed to maintain the facade as carefully anymore, letting her mask slip more and more frequently. She started spending more time with Diego, the personal trainer, and their workouts mysteriously moved from the gym to private sessions at his apartment, which she claimed had better equipment for the specific exercises she needed to do, though she could never quite explain what those exercises were when I asked. She would come home from these sessions glowing and energized in a way that had nothing to do with exercise, and she started buying him expensive gifts like a new motorcycle and a Rolex, claiming he was such a good trainer, he deserved bonuses for helping her stay in such great shape, which was an interesting way to describe what they were doing. She also began making comments about how I was getting older and slower, and how she was still young and vibrant, and deserved to enjoy her life, which was her way of setting up the narrative for the divorce she was planning. And she would make these comments in front of friends to establish a pattern of dissatisfaction. She started separate bank accounts that she thought I didn't know about, transferring small amounts from our joint accounts that added up to about $50,000 over 6 months. And she opened credit cards in her name only that she used for purchases she didn't want me to see on our joint statements. I hired a private investigator named James Chen who specialized in matrimonial investigations and came highly recommended by Marcus. And within 2 weeks, he had photographs of Sandra and Diego at a motel in the middle of the day when she was supposedly at her book club, which she had never read a single book, for in the 3 years she had been a member. James also discovered that Sandra had been married 3 times, not twice, as she had told me, and her first husband, a surgeon named Dr. Robert Hayes, had actually sued her for fraud, though the case was settled out of court, with a non-disclosure agreement that James somehow managed to get details about anyway through his connections in the legal world. The fraud case was particularly interesting because Sandra had apparently convinced Dr. Hayes that she was pregnant with his child, leading to a rushed marriage, only for him to discover after the wedding that she had never been pregnant, and had faked the pregnancy test and sonogram, which took a special kind of cold calculation that even I hadn't expected from her. James also found out that Sandra was already researching divorce attorneys, specifically ones who advertised themselves as aggressive and specialized in maximizing settlements for wives, and she had consultations scheduled with 3 of the top firms in Miami, all known for their ability to find hidden assets and destroy husbands in court. She was being particularly clever about it, using her friend Jennifer's phone to make the appointments and paying cash for the consultations, so there would be no trail leading back to her. But James had connections everywhere and nothing stayed secret from him for long. Armed with this information, I could have confronted her immediately, but that would have been too easy and wouldn't have taught her the lesson she needed to learn about trying to con someone smarter than her. So, I decided to let her play out her plan while I prepared my own response with Marcus, who was enjoying this almost as much as I was. I started acting more tired and older than I was, complaining about my health and talking about how the stress of managing our finances was getting to be too much for me, which made Sandra's eyes light up as she saw an opportunity to push for power of attorney, thinking she was manipulating a weak old man. I even started taking afternoon naps, making sure Sandra saw me dozing off in my chair, and I began forgetting small things like where I put my keys or what day of the week it was, though I was careful not to overdo it because that might trigger a real medical evaluation that would show I was perfectly healthy. She began suggesting that maybe I should retire fully and let her handle more of the household decisions and finances, since she had so much more energy and time, and it would be good practice for when I was really old and needed care, which was her way of infantilizing me while grabbing for control of the money. I played along perfectly, even going so far as to give her access to some investment accounts that appeared to have about 200,000 in them, but were actually just holding accounts that could be frozen instantly, if needed, while the real money remained completely invisible in the offshore structures that had been generating returns for years. Sandra's affair with Diego intensified, and she became increasingly bold about it, disappearing for entire weekends, claiming to be at spa retreats with girlfriends but really shacking up with her trainer at hotels that she paid for with cash. She thought I didn't know she was taking from the safe in our bedroom, where I had deliberately left money for her to steal. She started shopping for condos in Diego's name, looking at properties in the $300,000 range, which told me she was planning to set him up in a place after the divorce where they could continue their relationship, until she found her next Mark or Diego found someone younger and richer. She also started dropping hints about divorce, talking about friends who had split from their husbands and how much happier they were, and asking hypothetical questions about what would happen to our assets if we ever separated, which she tried to frame as innocent curiosity, but was obviously reconnaissance for her planned attack. The funniest part was when she hired her own financial advisor, a man named Stuart Bernstein, who specialized in finding hidden assets in divorce cases to secretly assess our net worth. And the poor man spent weeks trying to find additional accounts or properties, but kept coming back with the same number, roughly $1 million in total value, which made Sandra furious because she was convinced I had to be worth more based on the sale of my company. Stuart actually called me directly at one point, pretending to be from our bank and trying to verify accounts, but I recognized his voice from when Sandra had him over for dinner, and I played dumb, giving him only the information about the accounts Sandra already knew about while he fished desperately for more. She actually accused me one night of hiding money from her, which was incredibly ironic, and I put on an Oscar-worthy performance of being hurt and offended that she would think I wasn't being completely transparent with her about our finances, even producing fake bank statements that Marcus had prepared showing exactly what she expected to see. The fake statements were works of art, perfectly matching the real ones in every detail, except for the account numbers, which led nowhere, and the balances, which showed only what I wanted Sandra to see. And she studied them for hours trying to find evidence of deception, but finding nothing because Marcus was that good at his job. Sandra even brought in her friend Monica, the one who had convinced her husband to adopt her, to look at our finances, because Monica was supposedly an expert at finding hidden wealth, but even she couldn't find anything because there was nothing to find, at least not in any way that connected to me personally through any traceable path. Meanwhile, I started documenting everything Sandra did, creating my own file of evidence, including recordings of her phone calls with Diego, where they discussed their future together, and their plans to travel the world on my money. Once the divorce was finalized and she had her settlement in hand. I also had James Chen document her spending patterns, which were truly remarkable, averaging about $30,000 a month on clothes, jewelry, restaurants, and various services, not including the money she was secretly funneling to Diego, and her hidden accounts, which brought it closer to $40,000 a month. One particularly revealing recording was Sandra talking to Jennifer about how she needed to file for divorce soon, before I got too old and sick, because medical expenses could eat into the estate, and she wanted to get her half, while there was still something worth taking, which showed just how cold and calculating she really was. Finally, after 5 years of marriage, Sandra made her move, serving me with divorce papers on a Tuesday morning, while I was having coffee and reading the Wall Street Journal with a triumphant smile, like she had just won the lottery, which in her mind she had after years of planning and preparation. She had her speech all prepared about how we had grown apart and she needed to find herself and explore her own happiness. But she couldn't hide the gleam in her eyes when she mentioned that her lawyer would be in touch about dividing our assets. And she actually said she hoped we could remain friends, which was laughable. Her lawyer was a shark named Diane Fitzgerald, who was known for taking men to the cleaners in divorce court, and had a success rate that she advertised on billboards around Miami, showing pictures of happy divorced women with taglines like, "Got what you deserve." And Sandra had clearly promised her a percentage of whatever they could extract from me, which motivated Diane to be particularly aggressive. The first settlement offer was laughable, demanding not just half of our assets, but alimony of $15,000 per month for life, based on the lifestyle Sandra had become accustomed to, plus the house, the Mercedes, and half of my supposed retirement accounts, plus $100,000 for her emotional distress, which was creative. I responded through Marcus with a counteroffer that followed Florida law to the letter, offering half of our marital assets, which totaled about $500,000 after debts and expenses, with no alimony, since Sandra was young, healthy, and capable of working, though she hadn't held a job in 5 years, unless you counted gold digging as a profession. Sandra went ballistic when she saw the financial disclosure showing only $1 million in total assets, and she accused me of hiding money, lying about my wealth, and committing fraud. But when her lawyer and forensic accountant couldn't find anything more, Sandra began to panic, realizing her big payday was evaporating before her eyes. She hired 3 different forensic accountants, each more expensive than the last, including one who had supposedly found hidden assets in cases where the FBI had failed. But they all came back with the same result, nothing beyond what I had disclosed, because the offshore structures were that well designed and completely legal. She tried everything to find the hidden money, going through my trash, looking for bank statements, having Diego follow me to see if I went to banks or financial institutions she didn't know about, and even trying to seduce me one night wearing the same red dress from when we met to get me drunk and talking. But I maintained my story and my composure perfectly. The divorce proceedings dragged on for 8 months, with Sandra becoming increasingly desperate and vicious, as she realized that her big payday was going to be much smaller than expected. And Diego was already starting to pull away, since the sugar mama well was running dry, and he had found a new client at the gym who was younger and richer. During one mediation session, Sandra actually brought in a psychic who claimed she could sense the hidden money's location, which even her lawyer found embarrassing, and the mediator had to ask the psychic to leave while trying not to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. In another session, Sandra tried to argue that I must have hidden assets because my lifestyle didn't match my reported income, bringing in receipts for dinners and vacations, trying to prove I spent more than I should have been able to. But Marcus calmly showed that every expense was accounted for, and that I had simply been spending down my savings from the business sale, which was perfectly legal and reasonable. The mediator actually started to feel sorry for me as Sandra's behavior became increasingly erratic and demanding, and she made several scenes that had to be added to the official record, including one where she threw a glass of water at me and screamed that I had ruined her life, and another where she accused Marcus of being in on the conspiracy to hide money. Finally, we reached a settlement where Sandra got exactly what she was entitled to under law, which was half of our visible marital assets, totaling $250,000, plus the Mercedes, which was worth about $40,000, and some furniture and jewelry that she had picked out during our marriage, but which I was happy to be rid of. She had to sign the papers with tears of rage in her eyes, realizing that 5 years of marriage had netted her less than $300,000, which wasn't nothing, but was far from the millions she had been expecting and planning to live on for the rest of her life, and she actually asked if we could delay the signing to try one more time to find the hidden money. The beautiful part was that Sandra couldn't claim I had cheated her because everything was done completely legally and by the book, and there was no evidence of any hidden assets because technically they didn't exist in any way that connected to me personally through any traceable path that any court would recognize. The assets were held by trusts and corporations that existed before our marriage and were specifically excluded from marital property under the prenuptial agreement that Sandra had signed, thinking it only protected some family heirlooms and a small inheritance, but which actually contained language that Marcus had crafted to protect all premarital corporate structures. The moment the divorce was finalized, Sandra moved in with Diego, who dumped her 3 weeks later when he realized the money was gone, and she was just a 43-year-old woman with expensive tastes and no income, trying to live off a settlement that would last maybe 2 years at her current burn rate if she was careful, which she wasn't capable of being. She tried to come back to me, sending tearful voicemails about how she had made a mistake and we could work things out, but I had already changed my phone number and instructed security at my building not to let her in under any circumstances, and I had James Chen keep tabs on her just for my own amusement. The real revelation came 6 months after the divorce, when Sandra somehow found out about my actual wealth through a mutual acquaintance named Tony, who had seen me purchasing a $2 million yacht called Freedom that I had always wanted but couldn't buy while maintaining my cover story during the marriage. She hired another lawyer to try to reopen the divorce case, claiming fraud and misrepresentation, but the court rejected it immediately because I had followed the law perfectly, and there was no evidence of any assets that existed during the marriage that weren't disclosed, and the judge actually admonished her lawyer for taking such a frivolous case. Sandra's new lawyer actually told her that whoever had structured my assets was a genius, and that she had been completely outmaneuvered from the start, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it legally, which caused Sandra to have a complete meltdown in the lawyer's office that required security to escort her out. She then tried a different approach, having her friend Jennifer reach out to me with an investment opportunity that was supposedly guaranteed to triple my money, but was obviously a scam to try to find out how much money I really had, but I politely declined and suggested she try someone else who might be more gullible. The last I heard about Sandra through the Miami social grapevine, she was working as a real estate agent in Boca Raton, trying to find husband number 4 or 5, depending on how you count, but her reputation as a gold digger had spread through the wealthy circles she used to hunt in, and pickings were slim because everyone knew her story. She had also gained weight from stress eating and couldn't afford the personal trainer and cosmetic procedures that had been her primary assets in the husband hunting game, so her prospects were diminishing rapidly as younger versions of herself entered the market with the same playbook she had used. Diego, meanwhile, had moved on to his next sugar mama, a 60-year-old divorcee named Barbara who owned a chain of medical clinics and was apparently much more generous than Sandra had ever been, buying him a Lamborghini within the first month of their relationship, which must have stung when Sandra found out. Meanwhile, I've been living my best life at 68, finally able to enjoy my wealth openly, without having to pretend to be less successful than I am, and I've been dating a wonderful woman named Patricia, who has her own money from a successful medical practice, and doesn't need or want mine, which is refreshing after my experience with Sandra. Patricia actually thinks the story of how I outsmarted Sandra is hilarious, and she says it shows the kind of strategic thinking that made me successful in business, though she also says she's glad I don't feel the need to hide anything from her, which I don't, because she's genuine in a way Sandra never was. My children Michael and Rebecca are relieved that I protected myself and their inheritance from Sandra, and they both say that watching me play the long game taught them valuable lessons about patience planning and the importance of protecting your assets from people who only see you as a bank account to be emptied. Marcus, my lawyer, has used my case as a teaching example for other wealthy clients about the importance of proper asset protection before marriage, not after. And he says I'm something of a legend in certain legal circles for the patient way I handled the situation and the complete legal victory I achieved. The trusts and corporate structures remain in place and continue to grow with good investments and compound interest, and I've added provisions that will protect the wealth for my children and grandchildren from any future gold diggers who might try to marry into the family for money, because these predators are always out there looking for their next victim. I've also started a small foundation that provides financial literacy education, specifically focused on asset protection and prenuptial agreements for successful people who might be targets for predatory marriages, because I believe everyone deserves to protect what they've worked hard to build from those who would steal it through manipulation and false love. Looking back, I don't regret marrying Sandra because it was an interesting 5 years, and I learned a lot about human nature, greed, and the lengths people will go to for money. But I'm very glad I never trusted her with the truth about my finances from day one, when I saw her calculating my net worth in her head. The best revenge wasn't making her suffer or humiliating her publicly. It was simply letting her own greed and dishonesty lead her to exactly what she deserved, which was just enough money to think she had won, but not enough to sustain the lifestyle she had sold her soul for, which is its own kind of justice. Sometimes the best defense against a gold digger isn't to avoid them entirely, but to let them dig for gold that isn't there, while the real treasure remains safely buried, where they'll never think to look, and can never reach even if they knew where it was, because the law is on your side when you plan ahead and structure things properly. And to all the men out there who think they're too smart to fall for a gold digger, let me tell you they're getting more sophisticated every year, and the only way to truly protect yourself is to never let them know what you really have, and always remember that if someone seems too good to be true and too interested in your money, they probably are. If you like this story, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.